Today we are going to be making a pineapple quilt block. This quilt block is so fun to make and it is big. It finishes out at 16 by 16 inches. Now, this block I think is really special and I'm going to tell you why. So the first pineapple quilt I made used templates. You had to cut out all these tiny templates and then you had to cut out all your fabric from these tiny templates. And while the quilts came together beautifully and seamlessly, it was tedious work. So then I heard about these lovely trim tools. This one is a Creative Grids pineapple trim tool, and the next pineapple quilt I made was with this, and it was so much easier. But with this trim tool comes a price tag, and you only get so many sizes you can make. This one makes a 6-inch, 8-inch, and a 10-inch block, and you have to start with a certain size center square, and all that is fine if that's the look you want, but if you want a different look, you have to go a different route, right? So like I said, this is a 16-inch block, so my trim tool wouldn't have been able to make this. Could have used templates though, but we are going to toss out the templates for this block. We don't need that. And we don't need a special trim tool for this block. So well, we're not going to toss this because I already paid for it. There's no sense in possibly breaking it or anything else. We don't need to unnecessarily break anything. So we don't need a special trim tool. So all you'll need is whatever ruler you would typically use. I would suggest at least having a ruler that is longer than 16 inches. That will really help you. And if it has a 45-degree angle on it, even better. But I will give you some tips on trimming this block if you don't have a 45-degree angle on it. It'll just be a little trickier, but we'll get it done. All right, so let's dive into making this pineapple block. So it's really nice to have for pineapple blocks like an accent fabric for the squares and then some lighter fabrics and some darker fabrics. It really helps the block pop and make a really nice design. After selecting my fabric, I'm going to start cutting it. First, I'm going to cut my accent fabric into 3.5-inch strips and then subcut those strips down into 3.5-inch squares. From your accent fabric, you will also need to cut a 6-inch strip. You will then cut that strip down into 6-inch squares and then cut the squares in half along the diagonal. Next, from your light and dark fabrics, cut a bunch of 2-inch strips. Here are all the cuts you need to complete one block. I will have all of the cutting requirements available in a PDF on my blog that you can download. Please note that some of these aren't just one cut. There are 2 or sometimes 4 pieces here. It's just easier to lay it out this way. But like I said, all the information for one block will be available on my blog. And I will also put the cutting instructions to complete 20 blocks just in case you want to make a larger quilt out of these beautiful blocks. I decided to approach this pattern in rounds because we're kind of going around the block. Following me? Either way, it'll be easy to follow. So in round 1, we're going to take the center accent square and surround it with one of our light fabric choices. So to do that, you're going to first take the 2 3.5-inch rectangles and we're going to sew them to opposite sides of the blocks. We're going to place them right sides together and sew a 1/4 inch seam along each side. And after we sew that 1/4 inch seam, we're going to press the seam. I chose to press mine toward the center square, so that's kind of what my choice was. I don't think any choice is really wrong here because we're going to keep building this out, and you may find pressing the seams open works better for you. However you go, just make sure you press the seam. All right, so after sewing on the shorter 3.5 inch rectangles, we are going to add on the 6.5 inch. And this is still considered round 1 because later we won't have to do one side at a time, really. We'll be able to start adding on the next layers without doing this step because there'll be enough room to add them on. You'll see when we get there. So lay them right sides together and sew a 1/4 inch seam and then press again. This first trim is honestly the trickiest part of this whole pattern. So I'm going to give you a few tips to help you get it right. First, I draw an X corner to corner in that center square. I just used this Clover Choco liner that I absolutely love because I've not had any trouble with this color or the white to come out of my fabric. It may be a little hard to see, and I apologize for that. I just don't like putting the heat erasable pen or anything on the outside of my quilts because I find that sometimes it doesn't always come out. So I'm going to try to explain this in detail so you understand how to cut it. I'm going to do my best. So what you're going to do is on a ruler hopefully you have a 45-degree line. If you don't, that's also why I am showing this with the lines corner to corner. So if you don't have that line, you can take your ruler and go to the 2 3/8 mark, and that should line right up on your line that you drew. Now, as a fail-safe, you can also have the 45-degree line on one of your seams, depending on where it falls on your ruler, to help make sure you have the right angle to cut as well. So that 2 3/8, so 1 inch, 2 inch, and then 1, 2, 3 line should be right across that line. And then it also gives you a 1/4 inch away from your square point over here. So hopefully you are all seeing all of that lined up really well. And I think I just hit mine off a little bit. So let me line that back up. So that 45-degree line is right on a seam here. On my ruler, on yours, it could line up over here, over there. But as a fail-safe, you have that 2 3/8, so lined up. And then once you have it lined up, and I keep hitting it, I need to put some grips on the bottom of this ruler, that 1/4 inch, we have the 45-degree line, and then we can cut off one side. All right, and so then we're going to do the same thing to each of these sides on here. And now what I find helpful is you can line up that 1/4 inch line at the point here, but you also can do a straight line across that freshly cut edge, and you can still look and see if you're at the 2 3/8 line corner to corner. So there's a couple things you can look at to make sure this is lined up straight for you. So we'll keep turning and cutting each side. Again, we can look at all the different lines that we can line up on. 2 3/8, a straight line here, and cut. And then we just have one more side to cut. All right, and then we have a round 1 finish, and we can move on to the next set of strips. So this will be the last set that we need to put on, where we'll do 2 sides at a time. So we'll take our 5-inch strips in round 2 and sew them right sides together to opposite sides, just like we did in round 1, sew them in place with a 1/4 inch seam, press them, and then we'll sew on the final 2 sides, and these are 8-inch strips. All right, so here's how your block will look with all of the sides for round 2 sewed on. And the trimming and sewing gets so much easier from this step. So 1 3/4 of an inch away from the center block, we are going to trim. So I'm going to get that 1 3/4 line lined up on the seam here, and then we'll also double check over here at that point to make sure we're giving a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So once I get that lined up nice, I am going to trim. All right, and then I will turn and trim along all sides. And one thing you can also look at is to see if your ruler is lining up straight along the edge here. So you kind of have a few measurements you can look at to make sure you have everything straight. So I'm going to trim along each side 1 3/4 of an inch, and I'm going to look at all these different measurements to make sure things are lining up straight, to make sure I'm getting nice even cuts. You want to make sure you have that 1/4 of an inch over there. And just keep trimming around. So like I said, after that initial trim that is a little bit trickier, the rest of these trim up so much easier. So for round 3, we are adding on these 5-inch strips, and we're adding them onto each of the sides that we just trimmed. And then you'll also see it kind of stacks on the lighter strips we had before. So these are all going to get sewn onto each side. So we'll just lay them right sides together along that side and sew a 1/4 inch seam. And this time you can kind of sew them all on at the same time. You won't have to sew 2 sides on and then press. So it makes it a little bit easier for sewing, in my opinion. So sew them all on, press them, and then I'll show you how to trim this round. All right, so now that everything is sewn on, we are just going to trim again. And from here on out, we're going to be trimming 1 3/4 of an inch away from the round prior. So here it's along the seam of that dark strip. So we're just going to line up our ruler and trim. And we're just going to trim along all sides. So 1 3/4 inch and trim. All right, so there is the block all trimmed. And so now we're going to grab 4 more strips, and this is round 4, and these are 6.5-inch strips that are going to be added on to the side of the block that we just trimmed. So just as before, we are going to lay them right sides together, sew a 1/4 inch seam, press, and we're going to trim just as before. We're going to trim 1 3/4 of an inch away from the seam from round 3. All right, so for round 5, we're going to add on 4 6-inch strips, and these are going to be light strips. So these are getting added on to the side that we just trimmed. And after they are sewn into place and pressed, we will be trimming away from the round 4 edge 1 3/4 of an inch again. All right, so for round 6, we are going to take 4 7.5-inch rectangles, and these are the dark fabrics. And we're going to put them along the sides that we just trimmed. Then we'll sew them right sides together with a 1/4 inch seam, press them. We'll be trimming at 1 3/4 of an inch away from the seam along all 4 sides. All right, so for round 7, we're going to add on 4 7.5-inch light rectangles to the sides that we just trimmed. So lay them right sides together, so a 1/4-inch seam, press, and then again we will be trimming 1 3/4 inches away from the seam from the round prior. For round 9, we are going to take 4 accent triangles and add them on to the sides of this block so that it can now become a square. So to do that, I took 2 6-inch squares and cut them in half along the diagonal. So we're going to be able to add these on to the sides to turn this block into a square. Let me move this so you can see it better. So just as before, you're going to lay them right sides together and sew a 1/4-inch seam. After sewing all 4 sides, you will press the seams to finish off this square. Now, I'm also going to show you how to trim this block up after pressing. All right, so here is the block with all of the segments sewn on, and it looks pretty great. But honestly, with all of these strips getting sewn on and then this bias edge here, it can get pretty wonky. So we're going to trim this down to 16 inches. And to do that, all I do is line up the 1.5-inch line along the seam here, and I'm just going to trim across the block on all sides. And as you trim along each side, you'll notice that you're going to have one edge down here that is then completely straight. So you could also line up your ruler there to help ensure that you're getting a nice, even and squared block. So after all the trimming, like I said, this should be a 16-inch square. All right, there we go. So one more thing I want to show you is that if you keep making the blocks in this way, they'll come together and it'll be just beautiful. You're going to form another diamond here that will mimic the accent here, just be a little bit larger and add a lot of fun dimension to this block. You're going to see a design going around, connecting all of these segments here. But one thing you might notice is that these two greens come together here, and that might be okay with you, it might not. So what I'm going to do is make 10 blocks that look like these to bring my quilt together, and then I'm going to make 10 where I reverse this order. So I'm going to start with a green, go to a blue, a green, and a blue, so that these colors aren't going to be the exact same here. So just an idea for you. So I'm going to complete 20 of these blocks, 10 that end with green and 10 that end with blue. And then I'm going to make a quilt that is 4 blocks by 5 blocks, just like this. All right, so now I have 10 blocks that end with a blue strip of dark fabric. And I also have 10 blocks that end with the green strip of fabric. So now I'm just going to sew all of these blocks together in rows. I'm going to have 4 blocks in each row, and I'm going to have 5 rows. I laid it all out on my design board just to make sure I liked the way it looked. I mean, 1-block quilts are pretty fun. They're easy to really figure out the layout and everything. It doesn't get too complicated, but I still like to lay it out just to make sure I made the right amount of each block and everything's looking fine. I'm going to sew the rows together, and then I'm going to press each row's seams in opposite directions so I can nest them all, and then just bring the quilt together. It's really easy peasy after all of the block sewing. I know it was a lot of sewing and a lot of trimming to get these blocks, but isn't it worth it? They are so gorgeous. So I'm going to get this all sewn together, and remember, there is a PDF for this quilt available to you. You can go download it. I have each of the steps laid out there with photos, And I also give a graphic that reminds you on how to press each of these rows just to keep it really, really simple for you. This quilt was so much fun to make, and I hope that you decide to make it too. And if you do, I would love for you to share photos with me. You can either email them to me, or you can share them in the Facebook group, and you can find a link to that Facebook group in the description below, as well as a link to this blog post for this quilt where you can download the PDF file. If you do decide to download the file, I do have a link on that blog post to my Buy Me a Cup of Coffee site. And if you download it and have a few extra dollars, you can always buy me a cup of coffee to thank me for the PDF if you would like. You absolutely do not have to. It is a free download. All right, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.